Hello, everyone, and welcome. Due to technical difficulties, the first few minutes of this event were not recorded, and so I will be introducing the host and one of the panelists before letting the recorded audio and video version of the event play. Thank you all for joining us today for Camp Outside the Gender Binary and Heteronormativity, a conversation. We are grateful to the incredible panel of Camp Rising Sun alumni who will be sharing from their lived experiences today as members of the LGBTQ community. The intent of this conversation is to open an impactful and actionable dialogue that will help LHAF move towards more equitable practices for LGBTQ campers and staff. We're creating this space together with the understanding that this is a space for education and communal learning where participants can ask questions and seek understanding in respectful ways. Our panelists will be sharing from their professional experiences and their lived experiences as members of the CRS community, and we seek to learn from their experiences and ask that you join us in the conversation with an open mind. Before introducing the panelists, let me introduce the host of today's event. Today's event is being hosted by Chris Rehs-Dupin, who is a trainer and consultant with an organization called Transplaining, which is working to create a safer world for transgender youth and adults through training, community conversations, and empathy. He is a transgender man who spent 32 years living in a body and with an identity that never felt like his own. And he worked in the campaign industry for 17 years and held every position from bank counselor to camp director. Additionally, Chris was an American Camp Association standards instructor and visitor, and he believes in the power of youth organizations to change lives and in some cases save lives. With the high rates of LGBTQ suicide ideation and attempts, youth organizations are needed more than ever to create a safe environment that truly includes this unique, beautiful population of young people. The first of our panelists is Julián Cancino. Julián is the inaugural director of the Gender and Sexuality Center at Brandeis University, where he leads the university's efforts to create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive institution for women and LGBTQAI students, faculty, and staff. He was born and raised in Chiapas, Mexico, and Julián started his career at the National Center for Lesbian Rights in San Francisco. And he's a proud graduate of the University of California, Berkeley, where he helped establish the nationally recognized Undocumented Student Program to serve low-income first-generation and migrant students. Julián went to camp in 2003 and 2004.
Excited for our conversation, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, so next, let's hear from Sheila.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be here. I see all these lovely faces that I haven't gotten to see in so long. My name is Sheila Graham. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was a camper in Clinton in 1996, and then a counselor in Stendes in 2001 through 2003. I am a practicing psychologist. I also work in higher education currently. I'm in the counseling center at Loyola University, where I'm the associate director for social justice. And so these issues are issues that I am often thinking about and speaking with in regards to communities and how our identities impact communities. I've also founded an organization called Be More Empowered, who is currently under contract with LAJF as we do some anti-racism work together. And so sort of along with that work, as LAJF is exploring ways in which we can be sure to be thinking about ways in which our culture impacts all members of our community. I am extremely excited to be a part of this conversation. I identify as a Black cisgender woman. I am queer. I am married to a woman. We have 2 adopted children and we live in Baltimore, Maryland. I came out to myself, I would say, after camp and to the world during college. And so my experiences at camp, both as a camper and a counselor, have deeply impacted who I am today. And I'm excited to engage in this conversation.
Thank you, Sheila. We're excited to have you. And our final panelist is Carl. Carl, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, my name's Carl Manalo. I was a camper in 95 and 96. And I was an assistant camp director at Clinton in 2011. I am a cisgender gay man and actually came out because of camp and to my camp brothers and sisters first. You know, I am also in the Louis August Jones Foundation board. And so it's very important for me that these conversations are happening and that we are exploring this as a community because we can hear the different perspectives and what we think and where we should be going as a community. And this is super important to myself, to the foundation and to the board. I am also a high school principal, and I've been in education for about 19 years. This is my 19th year, and I've seen many students deal with identity, from racial identity to immigrant identity to you know, gender identity to, you know, sexuality, and seeing the impact that policies have on our students and change of policies as well. You know, I've been part of conversations in the Department of Education about LGBTQ youth and what we can do for them, including the conversation about our newest gender guidelines that came in 2019. And so, you know, that's proud work that we have. We have many more to go, but conversations like this are super important because that's when policies change and that's when hearts and minds change. So I'm glad to be part of this today.
Awesome. Thank you, Carl. So, you know, we got a lot of questions in, and a lot of them were detailed questions, questions about terms and ideas. And I want to get to those questions. But first, I think this panel is so valuable because of their lived experience that I kind of want to start with those kind of questions. So, and Carl, you just touched on it a little bit, but the first question I would like to know is, how did your experience with CRS affect your feelings towards your sexuality or gender identity? And you all can decide who starts.
This is a really loaded question. I've never, okay, so first of all, I've never been in an experience where it was a single sex environment, you know, outdated term. But, you know, I've never been, you know, in that environment before. And somebody who was struggling with their sexuality and their masculinity versus femininity and, you know, growing up where, you know, a feminine man was not valued and, you know, being pushed into sports and, you know, being more masculine, you know, it was an interesting time to go into an environment that was a little, I was very afraid of it because, but I wanted to also push myself because I wanted to be in that space because I've never fit into that space. And not having the regular societal norms of somebody playing a feminine part or somebody playing the masculine part, it changes after a while in the summer, and roles change and people take on different roles and people find value in you know, femininity, or people find value in different parts, or they don't, and there's a clash. And it's a great place to have explore that and to understand that, you know, who I was and who I was turning into, wherever I was wherever I was going, was valued. And you know, I had counselors who valued that, which I've never had that before. You know, and I can only speak for my experience and where that went. And so with what more we know today, I'm curious to see how non-binary people feel in the gendered settings that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Julián, would you like to jump in, or would you like me to? Happy either way.
Well, I guess I can just go ahead. And so I come from a rather atypical experience in that I had a very supportive family, biological family, in terms of sexuality and gender. And, and I say it's atypical because family acceptance is not the standard, right? This is what we're working towards. But, I come from an immigrant household, single parent, and my mother had a lot of queer and trans friends. My older brother's best friend is a trans woman to this day. So I was in this very atypical context. And so when I went to camp, I was weirdly not necessarily worried about my sexuality as I was worried about people being up on my business, because here I am, a teenager just exploring, and then all of a sudden I feel like people are asking me all these questions, and I was like, ew, gross, do not ask me about sex, do not ask me about these things. But also, right, I am in this sort of like girls camp, which is a unique experience for me. But the problem is that the acceptance of my family, which is almost also a negation in the sense that we don't talk about it because it's fine, you're accepted here, also created this void that I didn't have the language to talk about myself, or I didn't know how to, because I took it for granted. And so I think that as we're thinking about ways that we can address sexuality and sex ed, it almost saying sort of like, it almost felt like abstinence. Do not talk about it. Do not, do not practice it. We don't want to care about it. But it also didn't normalize this idea that, yeah, sure, I can be queer, but I also need to know what that means. And as a young person, sort of exploring myself, taking it for granted, but also knowing that it's a taboo. I didn't have the tools that we have now, right? And it's something that I'm now proud of, but it's sort of like, I do feel that in an effort to create a welcoming environment, then we sort of start taking things for granted. And so I think camp can think about ways in which we can talk about it, right? Talk about consent, talk about boundaries, whatever we decide to do, if it's to combine the camps or not. I do think that we need to start thinking about how to, give people these tools beyond the language, kind of like how to model these conversations. Just a quick story is, I did date during camp, right? It does happen. And I do remember the one conversation that I had with one of the camp mentors, the staff people, that was extremely helpful to me. And I was basically sat down and they would say, you're not in trouble, but you can't be hooking up with people. And I remember that the only question that I asked, I was like, well, can I hold hands? And so like, sure, you can hold hands, right? That's part of it. But you just cannot kiss, right? You cannot engage in this stuff. And what they said, what was different was just as if it were the person of the opposite gender, right? Which was the piece that made the whole difference to me, right? That I feel like I wasn't put into like, do not express same-sex affection, but it was rather like, this is not camp, what they were trying to do here, which I did appreciate. And even at that age, as I was trying to, do my teenage rebellion, that kind of reasoning and the way it was communicated felt appropriate, felt affirming. And I wish we could have more of these types of conversations.
Wow. I wish I'd gone sooner, because those are hard acts to follow. But I just have to name just how exciting it is to me that we are also in this conversation by virtue of who's on the panel talking about intersections of identity, because we are also all individuals of color. And I think those intersections, right? We don't come to camp as one individual, as a queer individual, as a trans individual. We come to camp as a full individual, and all of those aspects of ourselves impact our experience. So I can share that. So I attended Clinton in 1996, and I loved the fact that I was in a space and a place where I was surrounded by young women, where I was allowed to have a broader experience of what being a young woman or a girl at that point meant. I was used to being in gym class and basketball. They sent me, the girls thought I was too rough, so they sent me to play with basketball with the boys. And I eventually ended up playing rugby, which turned out to be the right sport for me. And I loved the empowerment that I experienced in being in a context where I was surrounded by people of my gender. And I recognized the privilege in that as a cisgender woman, right? And I also know we have a group, a beautiful group of individuals coming from all sorts of places and cultures, and that for many of us, English may not be our first language as well. So when I speak to being a cisgender woman, it means that my gender identity assigned at birth matches how I identify as a person, and also my gender expression. So I express myself as a woman, and yet within that context still, I felt pretty in our society, much like Carl, you were saying, in terms of feminism and masculinity, there's a pretty small range of that spectrum that I was asked to occupy. And in the ways in which my personality fits in a much broader spectrum, I would bump up against our society. And so being at camp where I learned to wood chop and I could build things, it felt incredibly empowering, right? And then came the time when, and Carl and I were both there in 1996, when the boys camp and the girls camp would come together, and the dynamic completely changed. My fellow campers were suddenly shaving their legs and wearing clothes when most of the time we were all wearing pajamas. And I experienced a significant loss that I don't think I was able to fully put into words at that point, but it felt like the dynamic suddenly shifted. And the people that I was connecting with in a one particular level were more interested in the connections, the potential connections with boys than there were in our sisterhood, in a way that was really painful. And so I was aware of that. I think in terms of my own identity, I was raised in Costa Rica, where Catholicism is very important, as it was in my foster family at that point. And so I was really struggling in the intersection of those identities for myself in terms of my religious identity and my now queer identity. When I came out in college, I identified as bisexual. And for me, the term queer feels more fitting, in part to be able to be embracing and acknowledging of the non-binary gender spectrum, recognizing that I am a married woman. I have my lovely partner and wife, who I am just so happy to be with and spend the rest of my life with. And I experience attraction across the gender spectrum. So for me to say that I'm bisexual would mean that I'm only recognizing two genders. And so that's the use of the word queer for me, is embracing of all members of our community. So all that to say, I feel like my thinking around all of the different ways in which CRS is impacted by gender and by sexual orientation is complex, right? As a counselor in Sendis, I was known as the vagina lady. And that is because, let me clarify, there's some board members here. That is because I would read the vagina monologues to the campers, because to me, empowerment of our bodies is so important, right? And so the notion that our sexual selves are not part of ourselves at a time when our bodies are experiencing as many changes as they do when youth are at camp, is one that we have to address regardless of what the composition of the camp is, right? Having young people be able to understand their bodies and themselves in the context of a society that doesn't always allow that is incredibly important.
Thank you, Sheila. I actually have a follow-up question. So I'm wondering about that time, and not fully knowing the landscape or the history of camp, but when you said the boys' camps and the girls' camps would come together and it would really change the dynamic, right? Like that's obviously something that happens in many spaces. And I'm wondering, and you or the other panelists can speak to this, do you think that had the same effect on the boys' camp as the girls' camp and the dynamic shift?
I'll let the panelists who attended the boys' camp at the time share that.
Yeah, I mean, people were showering more. It's a natural thing, right? We can't be, we can't be mad about people, who are, cis heteronorm, who want to interact with the opposite sex. But it definitely burst, as Sheila said, for me, it burst the bubble of, this place where I felt safe and, like this brotherhood that was being created, and then you include a variable, the one wonderful thing about it is I got to know my sisters, and I didn't get to know them in a romantic way. I got to know them in a deeper way that bonded me to a lot of people that are, that I've been friends with since 1995 and 1996. But it's also like, it was also very different in the sense that you couldn't participate in those, amorous pursuits, to a point where, I was faking having a crush on, a sister, and, just to be able to participate in that space, because I suddenly felt like I couldn't. And that was the part that was, and as I was learning to accept myself, I took myself back, and, that was a moment.
That's such a great point, Carl. And I think, unlike Julián's experience, part of the difference there is that it wasn't something we were talking about, right? No. So it wasn't being acknowledged, it wasn't being named, and yet it was happening in a very tangible way. And it's something that I don't know what it was like for the counselors, but having been at Stendis, it wasn't something that we ended up dealing with to that same degree, right? But the fact that there is, as you were saying, Carl, romantic interest, and that these are identities that we're experiencing at camp, I think are things that there needs to be room to be talked about, regardless of what the makeup is, so that we can have campers learn, for example, from Carl's experience, and also not feel like we have to pretend, right, to be experiencing what other fellow campers are experiencing.
I mean, the things that I've seen, I worked in Clinton in 2011, and we would have those days. And I think the super important and how it's evolved even over time is super interesting, because the days were very structured, and it left a room. What I was afraid of was that the empowered voices that we cultivated over the summer in 2011 were suddenly going to be, these pretty quiet voices, in an instruction. And so leading up to those days, like we had conversations about who are you, like how valuable you are, and making sure that the days were structured in a way that allowed both camps to engage in authentic dialogue and an intelligent dialogue, and to be able to showcase something more than just I haven't seen a girl in so long, I haven't seen a boy in so long, you know, like it was very wildly different from when I was in camp.
Well, one of the things that I am thinking as we're having this conversation, and it's something that has come to my mind pretty often as I think about inclusivity and integration, is that in an effort, right, to appear inclusive for the optics, we really make invisible a lot of inequities. So I guess I'm moving away a little bit from the sexualization of young people's experiences into also talk about some of the other inequities that happen, or gender dynamics that could potentially happen when you bring several genders together, right? So I think about how, you know, if you think about, you know, where you have cisgender men and cisgender women and trans folks and non-binary folks, typically when you combine these groups, the group that benefits is the cisgender male, because everybody else kind of like explains an experience, explains that experience, and all of a sudden these other cohorts do not have the opportunity to experience things themselves, right? And so the concern of a woman will always have to explain feminism, of trans people will always have to explain non-binary identities. And that is a concern of mine. And obviously it shouldn't impede us from having more inclusive conversations, but it should really turn us into, I think, something that I want to lift that Carl said, what the structure actually looks like. And so I think that, you know, I think about this wood chopping empowerment experience, right? And if you have a gender dynamic, well, then the young girls feel comfortable even attempting that, right? And so I think that we need to think about, from a programmatic standpoint, from a learning outcome standpoint, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And we can do that in a sort of facilitated way. I think that very often we see things very black and white, and there are no easy answers, right? And so I really stay away from saying, should we bring them all together? So we separate them? How do we do this? But really the question should be, how can we facilitate this in a way that we still preserve what we're trying to achieve with the independent camps, which is to bring sisterhood, to bring brotherhood, in a sense of sharing, right? That is not about positioning each of the groups almost like against each other, or in subordinate dynamics where one group has to explain to the other. So I want to also think about that because gender dynamics are very real, right? And so, you know, I think thinking about, you know, sexuality and sex, that's part of, you know, the young person's development, but I also think about what we're trying to achieve when we talk about, you know, gender justice and social justice at camp.
Yeah, I really think about this interesting thing that happens at camp to girls who come to camp, and that we have a culture that tells them that they need to be, you know, pretty and polished and clean and smell nice and all of these things that we don't really, you know, like that camp then immediately tries to disrupt. But in that disruption, do we actually create a situation that is really uncomfortable, right? So like they've been told they need to be all these things, and then they come into a space and we immediately trivialize them, you know, which I think is an interesting thing that affects girls' camps. And how do we, you know, not trivialize like the female experience, whatever that is, right? Because that's a whole complicated thing. But society tells you to be this thing, and then camp says, well, that's silly. And then you get out of camp, and then society immediately tells you to be that way once again. And Julián, to your point, I think those are some of the things that aren't necessarily based in sexuality, right? Like that's not all that goes into this decision. There's power dynamics and all of those pieces.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, and Sheila, will stay with you on this one, and then we'll bounce around to the other panelists. But you know, succinctly, because this is not a succinct question, what would you outline as the main benefits of a single gender environment? And when we say single gender, obviously we know that there's no such real thing as a single gender environment. Like I went to Girl Scouts when I was young, and that was not a single gender environment because I was there, right? So when you think about those single gender environments, what do you see are the main benefits?
Yeah, so I think some of the benefits we've spoken about here. So I think one of the benefits is the freedom to explore what expression might look like for each individual. And I think one of the beautiful things about CRS particularly is that we are bringing together youth from all over the world. And so one of the things that I think can be a huge benefit is understanding what it means to be a person of that gender in a different part of the world, in a way that that I do think is incredibly valuable for all the individuals at camp. I know, like some of what you just shared, Chris, in regards to expression of femininity varied, right? Because it's incredibly, there's a significant amount of diversity of that within a particular society, and then you bring people from all different types of societies. So I think one of the benefits is just being able to see, wow, to be a girl, a young woman, and a woman identified individual, a person who happens to be in this space that is occupied by cisgender people, regardless of how I might identify, can mean a lot of different things by virtue of the fact that I am also here.
Carl or Julián, you want to hop in on this question?
For me, it's again, like you have those social constructs of what masculine roles are and what feminine roles are, and then you take away a gender, a traditional gender, and there's a void, right? Because we're in the society, and people have to fill that void. Masculine men have to be, more comforting, or whatever it is that needs to happen, because the society still needs to exist within the small bubble that we are in for that summer. It changes things, and it makes you explore. For me, as somebody who's cisgender, it made me explore these parts of me that were told that weren't appropriate. And it was a value to it, because it was something that was missing and that was needed at that moment. And so there's a value to my sensitivity and my empathy, and my service to to others, and there was a value to it that I never experienced before. And so and those are wonderful traits to have as a person. And so that toxic masculinity has constantly taken out from our society as valuable. And I think that was the most important part for me, is because you kind of rocked the boat a little, because those traditional things didn't exist. But I think the conversation would have been better if we had a conversation about who are we after, and how does it fit in our lives, because we do go back to a world where all of those societal constraints are presented to us again.
What are you, I mean, every time I speak to people about camp, which I do actually more than I think I do, because it was such a memorable experience for me. It's been 17 years and I still talk about it. Everybody thinks it's a cult. It is such a weird thing to explain to other people, because I think I often be like, it's a hippie community, it's an experimental community, it's a summer camp, is 60 days. I don't know how to explain it. But the thing that I have come to sort of distilled is that it's a deeply intimate experience. There is a transformation that happens very, that I felt very deeply, that I cannot quite express, but I know that it really transformed the way that I see things. And it is also a communal experience, because I shared it with other people. And this weird tension between very individual and very communal is strange. It's almost like going through something very difficult together, except that it was not difficult. It was wonderful. And for me, while we do think about, did camp lie to us when they gave us a bunch of tools, told us that we were wonderful, and then we were thrown into reality and it's not quite the same. The way I think about it is actually a little different, which is I had 2 months to experiment, which is something that not everybody gets, right? To have a space to really explore and create something, whatever that is amazing, right? To have a sort of like no strings and no parents, no story behind. So to come to this camp clean slate and build a world with other people, and live it, right? That was really special. And maybe it's just because I'm trans and I'm always pushing against the boundaries, but having that freedom to exercise, my mind and to really live it was really special. Um, and and I feel like I do wish more people had that sort of sense of freedom, that you can experiment with something and take those lessons and run with them, even if they're not quite applicable to the world. Um, I do think that there's some insights that happen through that experience that manifest themselves in other ways.
For sure. And sometimes when I think about it, it is such a complicated question, and there's no clear answer, right? Like, especially being a trans person, I feel like one thing that is often not talked about as much is caring for someone's gender story all the way back, right, to like birth, right? So I was born assigned female at birth and then socialized female, right? So there are parts of my identity that get kind of just like deleted when you immediately shift into, okay, well, you're a boy now, and that means you're going just with the boys. I feel like I have so much in common in my experiences and in my traumas with females, and I don't feel like that's always cared for, I guess, is what I'm thinking. What space, when we want to create a single gender environment, whatever that looks like, what space do I fit into? Neither or both. And like it's kind of like retrofitting, right? Like it's really hard to fit something into a box that doesn't quite fit. And so I'm just that's such an open question, and again, like it's so complicated, because there are fewer trans folks, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to be cared for in the same ways. So again, I have zero answers, just a lot of questions. So no, I think that was a really good discussion of some of those positives of the space. So one thing I want to just kind of shift gears a little bit, because we had a couple of folks ask, how do you talk to the youngest learners about gender and gender identity, like our pre-K friends out there? And let's start with Carl. How about Carl?
I'm a high school principal, but I mean when I have conversations with other principals, no, it's okay. Like it's something that I've also explored. Even I'm actually doing a professional development for the Baltimore Lab School about LGBTQ issues, and they go from kindergarten all the way to the 12th grade.
Love it.
And part of it is not assigning heteronormative, keep pushing those things. Like I was having a conversation with one of my friends who is a pre-K teacher, and she talks about family, but then she talks about the the nuclear family of dad, mom, 2 kids, dog. And I was like, wait, but didn't you grow up with a single mom? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, then why is this the norm of what you are teaching? So, having a conversation about, the diversity of families there are, because those are things that they can relate to, right? These are things that they have or they may not have, or, is talking about like, pushing those things that we normally teach as normal into something more, and celebrating, those things, because we all come from different walks of life and everybody has different stories. So having children talk about their stories and what they experience is a good start first. I often talk about people with equity about this. Equity is about knowing, in education, at least to me, is knowing who you work with and knowing enough of their story so that you know how to work with them and you know how to help them. And valuing every single story and seeing everybody as an individual. Better how to work with somebody and being open to questions and that's the most important part. Allowing those questions to happen because they will be curious, they will ask. And that is to me the most valuable part.
Thank you.
I am happy to speak to this from the perspective of a parent and educating my own children. And as you mentioned, Chris, really important to sort of recognize how children are socialized. And Carl, as you're saying, right, the kinds of images and stories that children are told is what becomes their norm. So I'd gotten a chance to read that question ahead of time, and I wish I had brought the books with me, but we have tons of books in our house, all addressing all different kinds of identities. So I Am Jazz is one of my favorites. That's probably the first one that we that our children were exposed to. And what I loved about it, even though I'm not a big fan of her like YouTube stuff, it's a little too much for our children. But what I really loved about it is that it gave us the language to talk about what transgender means at a level that they could understand. So we probably started reading it when they were 2 and 1. So I mean like early, right? Just like anything else that we expose our children to, it's setting what they see as being the society, culture. And so the language that it gave us is to be able to talk about, and still binary, but about the differences between how we identify in our brain and what our body is. So in I Am Jazz, she talks about having been born with a boy body and a girl brain. And so that is the language that we adopted in our household. And it was a question that I began to ask our children maybe about once a month, recognizing that that's something that's dynamic and shifts. And they're currently, God, what am I children? 7 and 8. And when we talk about it, their answers have changed. In some ways, for me, as a feminist, sometimes I struggle with just how gender normative my children are. What have I done? And there are also ways in which they have the language to address and talk about things. And now at this point, have conversations with their friends that are different from the norm. So my son is able to say to his best friend, like, there's no such thing as a boy color or a girl color, which at 8 and 7 is like, that's their world. Like, well, this is boy stuff and this is girl stuff, to the point that now his best friend is also using that language, right? My children are a little revolutionary, as most of you know me probably are not surprised by that. But it is such part of their norm that when we're driving in the car, they see an animal in the street and my daughter will be like, oh, that's such a cute cat. He's so adorable. And my son will be, you don't know their pronouns. So it's just a part of our day-to-day language, right? For them, it is a part of how they see the world. And it allows them to be able to not then have this experience of like, oh, wait, this is other thing that I'm supposed to learn about when I am older, but rather it is part of their vernacular in our family. And that just, it's not just about pronouns and gender identity, but like I said, about all different kinds of things. There's also a book that we love called The Boy with Pink Hair. There's, a variety of things to just broaden that for children. And I think the hardest part is that it is an age, as a psychologist, I also understand that it's an age where developmentally, children try to simplify things, right? So their peers are all about boys and girls. Only girls play this, only boys play that. And so it is a constant, I would say, tension to be able to counter some of those messages. But I feel just like the way that I do about messages regarding race and messages regarding ability and messages regarding social class, that I have the responsibility to have them be able to at least recognize the material the world is going to be offering them, so that they can make sense of it in a different way rather than taking it in without any question.
I would like to offer a slightly different approach, which is more, I guess, intimate as a young person. And like I mentioned earlier today, I grew up in a very open and welcoming household, not only in terms of gender and sexuality, but in many other things. And what I am, I guess, offering is, I think, applies to young people, small children, but it could also apply to us adults, which is building relationships, right? Creating experiences together, sharing memories together. And what I'm inviting you to do is get out of your mind, right, into your experience. Sometimes we tend to think about gender and sexuality and all these things, and we conceptualize it, we intellectualize, and then we get stuck in, is this the right term, is this the right thing, and all of that creates a sense of anxiety and fear. And what I'm inviting us to think about is, how do we learn? We learn because somebody modeled the behavior, because we experienced something together that it was left us with a positive experience of a negative experience. So I will say that as we think about trans experiences, non-binary or race or anything else, have friends that are of these experiences, right?
Yes.
And your children and you know, even your partner maybe will see how you interact and engage with that experience. Because like any experience is an up and down, like any relationship, right? There are things you're going to be challenged, you know, does this fit with my upbringing? Does this fit with who I am? And all relationships are negotiations. And I think it is okay to model that relationships are work that is about, you know, pushing each other. Somebody in the chat mentioned the brave space, right? And how do we model that is that we negotiate with our partners, with our friends, with our work, and be able to model that for our children, I think is extremely important. A memory that I have is that as a young child, I always used my older brother's clothes, right? I was a young girl and my brother was a boy, and I just gravitated towards his clothes. As I was just getting dressed, right? I was just putting on my clothes. And so and my mother allowed it, everybody was fine with it. And I remember that my mother had trans woman friends, and they would come over to the house and they would talk. I never realized that they were trans until much later in life, right? But what I remember is that they will pick up the guitar and they will sing, right? And as a young kid, I love, you know, the singing, and I have vivid memories of them, you know, being around, you know, the dining table with the guitar and singing. And when I transitioned, I realized what a powerful memory that was, because with testosterone, with, you know, the medical transition, the voice actually changes, right? And so what they were doing is sort of finding their own voice, and I was witnessing that, right? And I wasn't until I was an adult that I was, wow, that was such a brave thing to do. And my mother was as a supportive friend, you know, being a witness to that. But for me, we were just singing, right? And that is the memory that I have. And it's a pleasant memory. And I later in life learned that, you know, in Mexico, their lives were very difficult, right? And so when I transitioned, my mother's point of reference was her friends. She said, this is a very difficult life. But she knew what it meant to navigate the fear of losing someone, right? And still being there for this beautiful moment. So as we're thinking about, you know, how to model this with our young people, with each other, is have friends, build relationships, connect with people.
Yeah. So I'm going to share one story about this, and that I was invited to read I Am Jazz to a group of preschool kids. I was so I've worked with kids for so long. It was probably the most nervous I'd ever been, because I worked for an organization, and it's just broadly accepted in our culture that we don't talk about gender identity. So I was so stressed out that I was going to cross the line, or a parent was going to call or whatever. So I read the book. I ramble off. I mean, it was so not eloquent at all, like about my own experience. And I was born a girl, and they were totally confused because I just made it too technical, like Julián was saying. And then I said, okay, I was ready. And I said, do you have any questions? And they said things like, what's your favorite color? When's your birthday? Do you have a dog? They didn't care, and that's the relationship. People often ask me, like, when are you going to tell your kids? Tell them what? I've told them everything. There is no, when am I going to tell my kids? That idea of when are you going to come out to them?
Right.
Normalizes the idea that this isn't normal. Like my daughter knows that I carried her and gave birth to her. They know they have a sperm donor. There's no secrets there. And I don't feel like it's something that we have to talk about or not talk about, because it's just our family and the way we're built. So, okay, we could, I wish this was going to go on for the next 5 hours of my life. Everybody go get a sandwich and come back. Just kidding. But I did want to bounce it out. If there are any lingering questions, I'm sure there's so many. But if anybody has a burning question, we could probably take one more in the chat before we wrap up.
So while we're waiting for the question, I feel, as a psychologist, I feel like I have to name the importance of mental health in all of this, right? So yes, while we're talking about a program and what is the inclusive and equitable thing to do, we also need to keep in mind that there's the potential harm that is caused for everyone's mental health, right? When these things aren't thought about or addressed in advance or dealt with in the moment. And as Julián mentioned, and Chris has mentioned, that there's the suicide rate for LGBTQ youth and for trans youth is particularly high, and that is not about the identity. That is about the construct of our society that makes the experience so challenging, right? And so for us at camp, and I know, I was a counselor prior to having my degree, but reflecting on the experiences of trauma that people come to camp with, right? The last thing that we want to do is create a traumatic experience at camp. My hope is that camp can be a place that begins to help people heal from those experiences. We had so many campers, thinking about Stendis in particular, where people were coming to camp with incredible amounts of social trauma, of just having been completely cut off by peers, and the impact of that on their mental health. And so when we are talking about these issues, we're also talking about mental health and the role that we want camp to play in that aspect of the lives of our youth.
It doesn't look like we have had any questions, but I think we definitely...
It looks like David Ives and Tim Connors have questions that maybe...
okay. Oh, I didn't see them. Okay.
They're waving their hands, so I didn't know if that was
okay.
I'm going to guess David's trying to say goodbye. I may have to leave for a bit too.
Okay.
David, did you want to talk?
Oh, you're muted.
How's this?
Okay, go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. It's so beautiful to see you.
Nice to see you also. I was an executive director during the 90s. And one of the things that I tried to do was to bring more people in from Arab-speaking countries.
Mm-hmm.
And they would not send their daughters to a camp. So there was another benefit. I got a couple of Arab countries represented, but it was a long struggle to make them feel comfortable that their son or daughter would not be violated. Make it known that I'm interested in these issues and would like to further discuss and be a part of events that might be able to share these thoughts with others. I just finished a book, and in there, an autobiography, and I talk in the book about my experience dealing with a difficult situation in camp in terms of societal and gender norms. It was really good to see some of these comments, and I really appreciate being able to be a part of it.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Oh.
All right. So I guess the end of our discussion is what's next? What's going to happen next? How does the conversation continue, and what actions do we take away? Because talking is just talking until we really put some change into place. So Sheila, I know you had some things you wanted to share.
Yeah. So as part of what is next, I'm sure there's a lot that the LAJF staff could speak to. But part of what is next is that, as I mentioned earlier, I am myself, and some of you may know Sarah Apedale as well, have been working with LAJF staff regarding in doing anti-racism work, but also part of that work involves creating or helping create some alumni associations. And one of the associations that we are hoping to get going is one for queer alum. And we can talk about sort of what LGBTQ plus alum might be a better name or term, but somewhat a group that includes the community that can perhaps continue to have these conversations and help guide what are some of the needs programming wise at camp as well.
Fantastic. Anything else before we close?
I just wanted to say thank you. Chris, we've met briefly, I think, but I'm the executive director of the foundation. I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today. This is, having this panel means a lot to me personally and professionally. I'm very pleased to be part of this organization, and even more pleased to be part of it 10 years from now. I wanted to just add to the conversation about what's next. I know that Eliam, you have plans for a book club coming up to follow. Did you want to say anything about that? And
yeah, we'll have an opportunity to read up more about this subject and have a conversation together in March. So that's what's happening on the alumni side.
And then from a programmatic side, as we are moving forward into the next phase of our organization, I think that these conversations will continue, not only on a societal level, but what is it that we're doing at camp, examining why, what are the pros and cons of all of these different variables. And there's going to be conversations to take part in. Our program committee is going to be looking at these, and I just ask you to join us in what's next. And it may be different from what we've been doing, but that it's going to be a beautiful future. And there were some questions just about our virtual programs. And I'll just mention that our virtual programs have all been all gendered so far. So our virtual summer camp experience last summer wasn't gender divided. It was all gendered, and it was wonderful. And yeah, I could go on, but I will leave it there. I know we're out of time, but it's been beautiful. Thank you to our panelists, who I each know personally, and it was lovely to have you on here. I will also give a plug. We have a podcast, and Carl Manalo was one of our guests and talks more in depth about his personal journey through camp and a little bit about his gender identity. And then Sheila, actually, as long as she's still willing, she's one of our next guests. We have to schedule the actual interview. But Sheila will also be on the podcast. And there are other people who are participating on the call. I see Ina. Ina was an interviewee, so you can find that on our website. Oh, and Elian put it in the chat.
Smart, smart. All right, well, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. And I think that is everything. And thank you all for being here and being open.